Looking at this map, you can see the sheer scale of an aviation milestone planned for 2027. Under an initiative called Project Sunrise, commercial airliners will attempt a continuous 17,000-kilometer flight path connecting Sydney directly to London, keeping passengers in the air for 22 straight hours. Back in the 18th century, a sailing journey between these two continents took up to a year. Even the very first successful flight in 1919 required almost a month of travel and 23 stops for refueling and maintenance. Now, a person will be able to leave Australia and step foot in the United Kingdom in less than a day. Milestones like this reinforce a comforting modern assumption. Because we can connect people on opposite ends of the planet in a matter of hours, we assume we have effectively beaten physical geography. We think the rigid borders and vast oceans that defined human history no longer constrain us. But executing a 22-hour flight requires an immense volume of specialized jet fuel. Pumping, refining, and transporting that fuel requires an incredibly complex web of heavy infrastructure, international shipping lanes, and deep earth extraction operations. All of those systems are permanently tethered to the physical crust of the Earth. We aren't actually post-geographic. The heavy machinery that allows us to fly 30,000 feet in the air is entirely dependent on the resources buried beneath the ground. And the modern struggle to control those specific, fixed points on the map is as violent and decisive as it has ever been. This map of the South Atlantic shows the Falkland Islands, an isolated territory roughly 500 kilometers from Argentina, but nearly 13,000 kilometers from the United Kingdom, who currently controls them. This tiny physical location is actively threatening to fracture the historic alliance between the US and the UK. This chart visualizes the scale of the catalyst behind the tension. Recently, an estimated 1.2 billion barrels of oil were discovered in the nearby Sea Lion field, a deposit so massive it likely holds more value than the entire remaining reserves of the North Sea. With potentially tens of billions of dollars waiting to be pumped out of the seabed, the geopolitical math changes. The United States, which has historically balanced its alliances by remaining strictly neutral on who owns the islands, is facing immense internal pressure to take a side to secure future energy cooperation. Frustrated by disagreements over military bases and global defense strategies, recent internal Pentagon leaks suggest U.S. leadership is actively exploring ways to punish British policy by pivoting American support away from the UK. Waiting to capitalize on this fracture is Argentina's new administration. Seeing an opportunity in the strained US-UK relationship, they are aggressively pushing a renewed diplomatic campaign to finally absorb the islands and the massive energy wealth beneath them. A tiny, wind-swept rock with fewer than 4,000 residents is capable of dictating diplomacy among the world's largest powers. It all comes down to the random geographic lottery of where carbon happens to be trapped under the ocean floor. Moving across the map to Eastern Europe, we can see what happens when the fight for physical geography turns kinetic. After initial offensives, the war in Ukraine has bogged down into an attritional, heavily trenched stalemate reminiscent of the First World War. The airspace above these trenches is entirely saturated by millions of small, explosive FPV drones. They have created a dense, buzzing kill zone extending miles deep into enemy territory. Moving a tank column across this physical terrain without being instantly targeted is virtually impossible.
Facing severe artillery shortages, both sides rely on these incredibly cheap, short-range weapons, simply to hold their geographic positions and bleed out the opposition's manpower. Because physical advancement is stalled, Ukraine has pivoted its strategy. Instead of throwing men into the meat grinder for a few yards of dirt, they are sending intermediate and long-range drones hundreds of miles deep into Russian territory. The targets of these long-range strikes are Russia's oil refineries and maritime export terminals. By repeatedly striking these facilities along the Black Sea coast and deep into the interior, Ukraine is systematically choking off the resource revenue that Russia uses to fund its military. When you can no longer push an army across a map with sheer force, warfare adapts. It becomes a calculated effort to destroy the geographic resources that allow your enemy to survive in the first place. But what happens when a society completely wins this geographic lottery, extracting vast amounts of resources in total peacetime? Looking at this map of the United States interior, you can see how the massive Mississippi River network drains 41% of the continent directly out through southern Louisiana. Combine that natural shipping lane with vast offshore oil fields and the Henry Hub, a junction where 11 major interstate pipelines converge, and the state possesses an unparalleled logistical advantage. To exploit this natural bottleneck, an 85-mile stretch of the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans was developed into a massive industrial corridor. It now houses over 150 petrochemical plants and massive refineries that process roughly a fifth of all American oil. By any traditional economic metric, this much industrial output should create widespread prosperity. Instead, Louisiana functions more like an impoverished colonial resource extraction zone, consistently ranking at the absolute bottom of the country for overall quality of life. For 80 years, a state policy called the Industrial Tax Exemption Program allowed global corporations to effectively excuse themselves from paying local property taxes, with local municipalities having zero say in the matter. Billions of dollars bypassed local schools, police, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, the staggering pollution emitted by these tax-exempt facilities created localized sacrifice zones, where residents face severely elevated cancer risks. Then there is the sheer physical cost to the land itself. To protect these multi-billion-dollar industrial sites from floods, engineers encased the Mississippi River in massive concrete levees. This straitjacketed the river, preventing it from depositing the natural sediment required to replenish the coastal wetlands. Starved of this soil, the muddy land of southern Louisiana began to rapidly sink. This projection map illustrates the alarming consequence of that human engineering. Driven by the combination of sinking land and rising seas, up to 3/4 of the state's remaining wetlands could completely vanish by the year 2070. That scenario leaves major population centers like New Orleans completely isolated as dangerously exposed islands in the Gulf. Without the natural friction of those marshlands to slow down incoming weather, the region's heavily engineered infrastructure is left completely exposed to increasingly violent hurricanes and storm surges. We build 22-hour flights and massive global supply chains to convince ourselves that physical distance and natural borders no longer dictate human progress. But the truth is, we are only borrowing against the map to sustain this modern illusion. And from the bleeding trench lines of Eastern Europe to the sinking shores of Louisiana, the bill is finally coming due.